Now, we would like to move on to our next lecture. Our second speaker is Professor Barton Malay. Professor Malay is Professor of Cognitive Linguistic and Psychological Sciences at Brown University. His research focuses on social cognition, moral psychology, and human-robot interaction. He is joining us online from the United States today, and while he will take part live during the final panel discussion, his lecture was recorded in advance. Please enjoy Professor Malay's lecture.
Hello, I'm Bertram Malay, and I welcome you to my presentation entitled A Society's Well-Being Depends on Norms and Their Enforcement. What is well-being? Well-being is a multi-level phenomenon. It exists at the individual, the communal, and the societal level. What I mean by societies is communities of communities, such as nations or cultures. What I mean by communities is interdependent groups of individuals, such as villages, neighborhoods, departments, or teams. Now, with these terms in mind, we can say that societies flourish, are at a high state of well-being when their communities find their needs met and coexist peacefully with other communities. And communities flourish when individuals find their needs met and coexist peacefully with other individuals. What makes all of this possible? My claim is that there's no society, no community that can flourish without the existence of norms. And there's really plenty of historic, anthropological, and sociological evidence. But I want to work out the implications of this idea a little further. What are norms? They're guides to action. They basically constrain an individual's options among several possible actions, and these constraints exist for the benefit of the group, such that the individual acts more likely in the group's interest. The individual has something like a motivational equation. There are self-benefits, and they stand in contrast to benefit to others, and also to self-benefits later on. Why? Because if the community interest is served, then often the individual interest is also served. So there are benefits down the road when a small sacrifice is being made early on. Furthermore, the power of reciprocity spreads benefits of norm compliance. So some people comply with norms that typically encourages others to do the same, such as sharing a hunt. I'm successful today, I share my hunt with you, and tomorrow you might be successful and share yours with me. But prospective benefits of sharing and serving the community are probably not enough. The temptation to benefit oneself, especially in the short run, are pretty high. So we need another mechanism, and that's costs of norm violation to change people's behavior. The regulation of norm compliance, and in particular the way to deal with norm violation, exists in a larger set of tools. And I just want to briefly point those out and then focus in on what I'm really interested in, namely sanctions. We can think of proactive and reactive forms of regulation at the individual and at the social level. At the individual level, we have internalization, that is to make norms of society really be part of your own values, to anticipate that you might feel guilty and therefore maybe not commit a norm violation. If you have committed a norm violation, you may feel guilt, you might try to justify your action. And at the social level, we do proactive things like activate norms through signs and our own behavior and remind people what's the right way to act. We might induce fear or guilt before people commit a norm violation. And finally, after a norm violation happens, we might forgive them, but we might also distribute sanctions. And in that particular locale is where I want to explore some further. Two main forms of sanctions, and maybe the major forms of sanctions, are blame and punishment. They're not just two forms of sanctions, however. They're really two ways in which communities more broadly regulate norm compliance, and two forms of historical communities. In small interdependent groups, we find that people rely on mild and interpersonal sanctions. What I mean by that is blame as moral criticism. In large, hierarchically structured societies, typically of societies of strangers, rely on harsh institutional punishment. So my thesis is that the well-being of a society can increase if we have well-regulated interpersonal moral criticism and less institutional punishment. In the rest of my presentation, we'll try to make a case for this thesis by going through some history and some structures of blame and punishment today. So let's look at some of this cultural history, first of blame. Archaeological and anthropological evidence tells us something about hunter-gatherer society in the past, in the recent past, when we were able to study them, and in the prehistoric past, about which we infer our own ancestors' way of living. The groups that we're talking about here were small, nomadic, that is, they moved from place to place, did not have a particular settlement in which they lived for a long time. They were egalitarian, at equal levels of status and rights. They had few to no possessions. Life was transparent, everything was out in the open. There were no houses to return to. The power of reputation was very, very high. Everybody saw what you did, and your status was in part always on display. Reciprocity existed through the hunting, sharing that I mentioned, and many other ways as well. And in these circumstances, you don't want to punish, be very strongly critical of people, but rather you want to measure your criticism, maybe even just ridicule a norm violator or gossip about a norm violator. These mild interventions are really the prehistoric form of moral criticism or of blame. In extreme cases, we do know that sometimes repeat offenders would be disregarded, would be expelled maybe from the group altogether. But often these norm violators might actually change groups on their own. The norms that existed in these societies and still exist in the few that are left are really there to coordinate and maintain equality among the group members. As group sizes increased from family to clan-based groups, we find that there are more encounters with other groups. Coordination is not just about the members within the group, but also about the relations with groups outside, and eventually leads to group conflicts. And that's the transition to the cultural history of punishment, when we find the emergence of sedentary societies, societies in which humans settled down for a long time, for generations and generations, and built smaller villages to larger cities. Obviously, we see population growth be both a cause and a consequence here. Why did populations grow? Because there were favorable environments. The end of the last ice age made lands suddenly much more fertile than before. Food resources were discovered, were bred, were encouraged, and were studied. When you don't move from place to place, you can have more children. The number of pregnancies per time unit was much higher. Thus, you had more children. You also had to feed the growing population. Therefore, you had to be inventive to come up with new food resources, new food technologies. And you get a feedback loop. You also get a feedback loop through property. You have land, you have tools to exploit the land, you build dwellings to live in. People who have those things have status. Those who have status and have offspring through inheritance make those offspring also have status. And you have family lines of status. And more we find that elites form in a more hierarchical society. And these groups, each with certain elites in the leadership, begin to also fight over the favorable land, the resources in the land, labor, and you have more and more intergroup conflicts. Out of that really grows the institutionalized form of punishment that we see still today, but that really isn't that old. 12,000 years ago is when humans for the first time moved from nomadic to sedentary lifestyles. All of these properties of population growth and feedback loop and intergroup conflict led to new crimes, such as owning more encourages others to take away from you. Groups fought with each other, so you needed military defenses. You needed coordination all the way to laws and to organized structures of law. And that over and over again led to steeper hierarchies, strong pressures to centrally organize, to distribute some of the resources, but also to control the resources. And as humans, we are capable of being egalitarian, which we have hundreds of thousands of years before human settlement. But like other primates, we also are very much capable of living in hierarchies. So let's take a look at cultural history in one more layer, namely that's the escalation of punishment severity. And this is an important element. Punishment by itself may seem to be a natural part of a legal system, but the increase in punishment severity is not a natural part of a legal system. The concentration of power, of wealth, and the threats to the top of the hierarchy really often lead to increases in punishment and often unfair punishments, because there might be revolts of dependent labor, of slaves, of prisoners of war. Those in the top of the hierarchy will pass laws and defend themselves, defend their position, maintain the hierarchy. And you find this in history over and over again. The harshest punishments are for mutiny, for treason, for those crimes that challenge the leaders, including tax evasions, at least in the Middle Ages, very harshly punished. You also have an interesting effect that when there's intergroup war, when there's intergroup conflict, it leads to an increase in brutality within societies. There's evidence all the way into the 21st century of that fact. In addition, you have a crime loop, a rising crime loop, such that often there's some propaganda of the leadership to demonstrate some evidence or claim that crime is on the rise. That gets then used as justification to increase punishment. That punishment is often unjust because in part it also defends merely the top of the hierarchy. What we see is that crime very rarely decreases when punishment gets harsher. Historically, over and over again has been studied. There is no clear response of crime decreasing when punishment increases. And even when crime does decrease, very often what we see is punishment does not go down. So you see maybe an increase in perceived crime or actual increase in crime. Punishment increases. Then crime goes down, but punishment remains at the high level. That means you ratchet up punishment severity. We find this, for example, in the US in the 1960s to the 1980s. Crime did, in fact, really increase. It was exaggerated in the news media, but there was an increase. Then very harsh punishment was instituted, 3 strikes and out, a longer prison sentence, mandatory prison sentence, a number of policies. Crime then slowly went down, probably not in response to those policies, but despite the policies. But as the crime rates went down, the policies did not change. And that has happened many, many times in history. What does blame look like today? Well, again, blame for me is moral criticism. It's an aim to change behavior while continuing one's relationship with the norm violator. It also is an attempt to teach the violator norms, to remind them of the norms, to remind them of the importance of their reputation and our relationship. It is the predominant form of sanction in small interdependent communities, from families to teams to departments. But even in stranger relations, we find that it is preferred over punishment. Evidence shows that people are very reluctant to punish other strangers because of fear of retaliation, but also because it really is against the norm of respect. We might criticize, we might shake our head, we might frown, we might tell others, but we very, very rarely punish other people. Nonetheless, expressed blame is not just a happy act of expressing disapproval, but rather it is also costly. It is costly to the transgressor, who might have bad feelings, experience a damaged relationship, experienced damage of reputation. There might be costs to the moral critic. Again, the damaged relationship, possible retaliation if the transgressor does not agree with the criticism. If the criticism, furthermore, is unfair, there might be loss of community protection. Normally, when we are in a community of others with whom we share norms and somebody violates a norm, the critic might be supported by the community in that criticism, might find the support of the community. But if it's an unfair, exaggerated criticism, suddenly the community may turn against the critic and may actually support the transgressor. There are also costs to the community. When there's strife and damaged relationship among the members of a group, it always requires additional work finding out how to fix it. If there is unfair criticism that goes around, then there might be a loss of trust. Because if I think that one of my friends unfairly blames another one of my friends, then maybe next time I wonder whether that friend also will blame me unfairly, or that one will blame another and that one will blame me, and so on. All of those costs lead to a certain demand on the community to keep the costs in check, and they often do that by setting standards of evidence for blame judgments. Let me explain this a little more. Standards of evidence consist in part of what information you process. In a model of blame that we published in 2014, we showed that over many studies in the literature and then our own studies as well, we can show that people take into account a number of pieces of information when they make blame judgments. What was the norm violation? Did the agent cause it? To what degree did the agent cause it? Was it intentional what the agent did? If it was intentional, did the person have justified reasons to do it? If it was not intentional, could the person have prevented the negative outcome? Should the person have prevented a negative outcome? And all of those factors lead together to a certain degree of blame. Only when you consider all this information do you consider high standards of evidence as the basis for your judgment. Those judgments can be challenged. What it means to have high standards of evidence means that I can challenge your blame judgment, I can ask what the basis of that judgment is, and you may then have to justify that judgment. Those pieces together keep in check unfair, sloppy, inaccurate, attacking judgments. Because it becomes costly to make those judgments, people may try harder, be more careful in processing the information. I'm going to give you two examples from our own work for how such careful processing really looks in the domain of blame. The first is, how do you find the information? How do you acquire the information? There's a study with Steve Guglielmo in which we looked at basically this blame model that I sketched on the previous slide and placed people into these different boxes here, especially into the upper three boxes. We described a negative event, and we asked people how they would find out how much to blame the person. We described the negative event with some additional information about causality and asked them again. Or we described an event in even more detail, describing the person actually intentionally doing something bad, and asked them how much blame the person deserves. So we put people into different positions of information, and each time just simply asked them to ask us questions. We then classified those questions and found that predominantly they asked the kinds of questions that this model predicts, that if you find a negative event, the first thing you want to know is whether the person caused the negative event. If you know that the person caused the negative event, was it done intentionally? If it was done intentionally, what were the person's reasons? And so on. Now, these are not 100%. People do a variety of things. They sometimes jump ahead because they're so confident that they already know some piece of information. They ask about the next one down the row. Sometimes they go back because they are uncertain, maybe because of a piece of information they received, and they want to recheck what they initially assumed. And in a few cases, they also ask a second question about the same location of information because they're not yet confident. But generally, the order of these pieces of information is quite systematic and quite careful across a number of different violations. A second piece of evidence for the careful processing that people undergo is information updating. This is work with Andrew Monroe, in which we look at basically two stages. An early stage in which you might form a blame judgment on the basis of very vague information. All you know that somebody did something negative, you don't even know whether it was intentional or not, for what reasons. Or you just are asked to give a first blame judgment. But then we give you updated information and we ask you to make a second blame judgment. We then vary the type of updated information. We tell you that it was intentional what the person did, or we tell you that it was unintentional. We tell you that it was intentional and done for bad reasons, or that it was done intentional and actually for good reasons. Or we might tell you that it was unintentional and really preventable, or unintentional and not preventable. I can't go through the details of deriving exactly the predictions of how blame changes according to these different pieces of information. But in this paper, we do this step by step. What I want to show you is the overall pattern of change. When you learn that it was intentional, either for bad reasons or you don't know the reasons, blame actually goes up from the initial vague stage to the updated stage. When you learn that it was intentional, but for good reasons, for justified reasons, blame sacks down by 25 points on a 0 to 100 scale. When you learn that it was unintentional, your blame ratings go down. That is part of mitigation. If you know that it was preventable, the mitigation is weaker. If you know that it was unpreventable, was not preventable, your mitigation is very strong and you blame the person very little. This overall pattern is very stable across study after study after study. We show, for example, that it doesn't matter whether you are under cognitive load or not. That is, whether you're trying to remember an important 7-digit number. You make the same information processing steps. You arrive at the same blame judgments. Even when the first judgment is silent, that is, we don't ask you to make a blame judgment right away when you hear the vague information. We only ask you after the second piece of information. That means we're not putting pressure on you to adjust because we don't even know what your first judgment is. All we ask is that you consider the first piece of information and then the second piece of information. No change, same pattern of blame judgments. It's also not different if we give you all information at once, rather than in two stages where you might first anchor on the first vague information and then your second judgment is really strongly influenced by the first. Classic judgment decision-making pattern called anchoring and insufficient adjustment. But we find no evidence for that. There are no anchoring effects. And I show you just the graph here. These are the final blame judgments, not the change pattern, but the final blame judgments. And they basically go in a systematic pattern, whether or not the first judgment is silent, whether or not you do it in two steps or in just one full information condition. There's one pattern that we found that varies, where blame judgments do change, where these overall information processing patterns seem to be altered. And that's when we compare in-group versus out-group targets. So if I'm a liberal Democrat and I judge another liberal Democrat's norm violation, then I'm in the in-group target group condition. If I'm a liberal Democrat and judge a Republican, more right-wing oriented person, then it would be an out-group condition. So people judged members of their own group and members of the other group at the ideological level in the same paradigm that I just showed you. Overall, we find the patterns are still similar. White is the average across 5 studies in the paper, and then the 6th study varied in-group, out-group. Green is very similar to white, and red differs a little bit. Not a whole lot, but it differs a little bit. We find that there's less mitigation for out-group members when you hear that they did something bad intentional, but it was for good reason. you don't quite give them the same benefit of the doubt, that it was really for good reasons. You also don't quite mitigate blame as much when you merely hear that it was unintentional. Maybe you assume that it was probably preventable. What we also find is overall, it's a little bit more blame for outgroups. 5 points on a 0 to 100 scale. This is not a whole lot. People are still fairly careful in processing information here, but they do mitigate less blame for outgroup targets. So we have one factor, outgroup, in-group, and there are a few other factors that we hypothesize and have observed some evidence that those standards of evidence, the care with which people process blame-related information, do change. So online communities, outgroup transgressors, and low-status transgressors typically induce lower standards of evidence. People are not as careful in processing the information. They are more quick to express blame judgments. When the critic is low status, or when you live in tight-knit communities, it's the opposite. You have higher standards of evidence. People who are in low status often have to provide particularly strong evidence to criticize somebody who might be at medium or high status. And if you're in very tight-knit communities, then those expectations of fair, well-processed information for blame judgments are very high. But even though these standards can be altered up or down a bit, in many cases blame is socially regulated to be responsive to evidence, to limit costs to transgressor, to critic, to the community. And in many cases, blame is really made to repair relationships and continue relationships after moral criticism. It doesn't always happen, of course, but in many cases it does. Punishment looks quite different. Let me tell you about interpersonal punishment and then about institutional punishment. Interpersonal punishment has been claimed to be important for human cooperation, for really the evolution of human cooperation. People have, from the basis of behavioral economics experiments, argued that costly third-party punishment leads to cooperation. What does that mean? Third-party punishment is if this person here is mean to another person or takes away something from another person, maybe assaulting the other person. I'm the third party because I'm not the victim, I'm not the perpetrator, I'm observer, and then I may or may not punish the perpetrator, the transgressor. It's true that in these behavioral economics experiments, you find that people are sometimes willing to take money away to punish the perpetrator. But there is also mounting counter evidence. First of all, third-party punishment is rare, both in behavioral economics experiments, where you might find it 30-40% of people doing it, but in real life, much, much less than 30-40%. Further, we find that if you have a punisher in this third-party paradigm, they're actually not trusted very much. They're not liked very much. So it doesn't seem like that's exactly the best way to get cooperation. Furthermore, if you give people a choice to either punish the perpetrator or compensate the victim or just communicate your displeasure to the perpetrator or just choose somebody else in the next round of your economics experiment, people will actually do any of these things much more often than punish. If you only give them the option to punish, then they will use punishment to express their displeasure and maybe also declare to the experimenter that that was really a norm violation and I know it. Generally, people find that threats to reputation are often sufficient for cooperation. Knowing that others can observe you when you cheat, certainly sufficient for cooperation in many cases. Knowing that other people may talk about you may be sufficient. Punishment may sometimes add to that, or the belief that you could be punished might add to that. But punishment itself as an act of taking resources away, of maybe demeaning the other person, is typically not needed. It's not a primary method of interpersonal sanctions. But what about institutional punishment? Well, that certainly is alive and well. It exists often when informal sanctions, for example, blame, are no longer effective. It's a violent crime. It's done by a whole group of people. There are specific laws that are violated. Then blame and moral criticism are just not the right ways to respond. We find that over the centuries, there has been progress from brutal to reformed punishment methods, from torture to incarceration to maybe monetary fines. But still, to this day, institutions are fundamentally hierarchical, whether it's school, work, law, education. And fundamentally hierarchical means costs are asymmetrically assigned. They always highly disfavor the transgressor. Not only for the particular act that they did, but in part the whole system declares that it is bad to be a transgressor, to commit a crime. The relationships between the transgressor and the community, or between the transgressor and those who punish, either don't exist or are severed for good. So the room for reform is really very narrow. Furthermore, the standards of evidence are controlled by the top of the hierarchy. So if they want to get rid of transgressors that maybe challenge them, it's very easy to do. You just change the standards depending on who the transgressor is. That means biases are very difficult to combat, and we see this over decades and decades, despite observations and data and declarations. Racial discrimination is still very strongly embedded in the US penal and legal system. The legal ideals may exist, and they may even be in the law itself, innocent until proven guilty, but they can be easily corrupted in these highly hierarchical structures where those who declare punishment and those who are judging do not have relationships with the ones who are being judged. Finally, also problematic is that recidivism continues to be high. Recidivism is the likelihood of committing another crime after you've committed a crime before. The likelihood of being caught again for a crime once you've been in prison and being imprisoned again. These rates are between 60 and 80% in most countries in the world, and certainly in the US. Deterrence is also weak. The likelihood that somebody will not commit a crime merely because they know that somebody else was put in jail, very low. People do not take it very seriously. So that does not seem to be the right way to combat crime and norm violations. So what is? Well, in conclusion, I want to propose that there are ways of healthy norm regulation and maybe more effective norm regulation. It is deeply human to have norms, to be tempted to violate some norms, and to expect sanctions and to deliver sanctions when people do violate norms. In order to keep this system, to make it possible that societies and communities can flourish, prospective work is needed. Norm teaching through socialization in schools, norm activation, that is, we remind each other, we put up signs, we have documents, we train each other. We can stress reputation, importance of being seen and liked by others, interdependence, of being fair to one another, respect one another. All of that is part of a healthy norm regulation before norm violations exist. But when violations have happened, then there still is a way of well-regulated moral criticism. It can really be effective. Should have high standards of evidence, meet high standards of evidence, such as processing available information, maintaining the relationship, respectfully criticizing, using minimal costs to achieve insight that the perpetrator gains and change in the perpetrator's behavior. Minimal costs means how little do I have to say to make the message arrive, to make the change a motivating change for the person. That means there are social demands and standards of evidence that influence how we criticize each other, how we effectively criticize each other. That is, there are norms of moral criticism at the next level up. If punishment is necessary because of the severity of the crime, of the violation, then we also should take into account that it needs to be a fair process, not just in the books, but in reality. It needs to be an impersonal process, that being a member of a group should not make it more attractive to give a longer prison sentence to another. There should be minimal intensity to the punishment that still achieves reform. That means in many cases we need to deeply rethink our punishment methods. There are less punitive alternatives. There's community policing that is more on the prospective side, but can even be on the reactive side when the community detects a crime and together works maybe on the person's reputation, demands certain reparations, compensation from the person. Police, in the formal way, may not be needed. Restorative justice is a method that really goes back to the old ways of moral criticism, of dealing with the perpetrator in a small community. Basically, what happens here is when, for example, juvenile delinquents are given a chance to not go to jail, but rather to talk to the victim or to members of the community and basically face their criticism. Maybe explain themselves, maybe apologize. Endure the fact that they have to see how their victim felt about the crime. Turns out that when people go through this restorative justice method, recidivism is much, much lower. They're much less likely to commit a crime again, to arrive in prison again. Transformative justice is an even more daring process of not just changing the person who committed the transgression, but trying to change the entire community that allowed the person to commit that crime. In an extreme case, it is the demand that we need to change our schools and our social communities in order to prevent and reintegrate kids who are violent. Maybe you don't want to reintegrate the person who just shot 5 children, but we need to rethink what led to that and transform the entire community and not merely punish the one who violated the norm. If we do all that, if that is possible, then we might achieve a level of moral well-being for individuals, for communities, and for society as a whole. With that, I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.